The energy around this situation is intense, and Spirit is immediately bringing forward something that has been hidden for a long time. Your person did not walk away from the third party because things were fine or stable. They left because something inside them snapped. Something shifted. Something awakened. What happened behind the scenes is nothing like what people assumed. Your person reached a breaking point where they could no longer deny the truth they had been trying to bury. They were emotionally, spiritually, and energetically tied to you, not the third party. And this realization didn't come gently. It came through chaos, conflict, and a deep inner collapse that forced them to finally make a decision they had been avoiding for too long. Spirit is showing that your person had been living in two separate emotional worlds, one that looked stable on the outside and one that was crumbling on the inside. The third-party situation became heavier than they expected. The connection felt forced. The conversations felt repetitive. The energy felt draining. They started to feel trapped, suffocated, disconnected from their own spirit. Your person was trying to convince themselves they made the right choice, but every day the emotional weight grew heavier. They would wake up with a knot in their chest, sensing they were living a life that didn't align with their truth. They were going through the motions, but their heart was somewhere else entirely. Their heart was with you. Behind the scenes, arguments began to surface. Misunderstandings grew. The third party sensed your person's energy shifting. They felt the emotional detachment. They felt the avoidance. They felt the distance widening. And instead of pulling your person closer, it pushed them even farther away. Spirit shows moments of emotional tension, where your person felt unheard, unseen, and misunderstood. The third party tried controlling the situation, clinging tighter, but that only triggered your person more. Instead of feeling secure, they felt pressured. Instead of feeling supported, they felt suffocated. Instead of feeling connected, they felt trapped in a version of themselves they no longer identified with. Your person started comparing energies, how they felt with you versus how they felt in the third-party dynamic. With you, they felt alive, inspired, real, seen, safe, spiritually connected. But with the third party, they felt drained, stuck, and emotionally empty. The contrast became impossible to ignore. They tried to hide it, but Spirit chose their internal world collapsing. They couldn't pretend anymore. They couldn't keep walking around with the truth screaming inside them. They knew they had made a decision based on fear, pressure, timing, or confusion, not on their heart. Spirit is showing a moment, a sudden realization, almost like a lightning strike. Something happened that finally woke them up. A conversation, an argument, a moment of clarity, and in that moment, they finally accepted what the universe had been trying to tell them over and over again. They were never meant to stay where they were. They were never meant to settle. They were never meant to force a connection their soul rejected. They were never meant to live in emotional denial. They were meant to follow the truth of their own heart, even if it scared them. And that truth led back to you. Behind the scenes, your person tried ending the situation quietly at first, but it didn't work. The third party resisted. They tried guilt. They tried emotional manipulation. They tried controlling the narrative. They tried reminding your person of the history, the promises, the expectations. But nothing worked this time. Your person had already emotionally detached. Their soul had already chosen. Their spirit had already awakened. And once someone awakens, they can't go back to emotional blindness. Your person began pulling back more aggressively. They stopped explaining themselves. They stopped apologizing. They stopped trying to make it work. Their silence became their decision. Their distance became their truth. And eventually the third party realized there was nothing left to salvage, nothing left to hold on to. The connection had died a long time ago. Your person had outgrown it. Spirit reveals that your person didn't leave for passion or excitement or attention. They left because they realized you were the only connection that ever felt real, spiritually aligned, emotionally fulfilling, and divinely guided. You were the one that awakened their soul. You were the one that challenged their growth. You were the one that touched their spirit. You were the one that felt like home. And now, with the third-party situation closed, your person is standing face to face with a truth they can no longer run from. They didn't leave because of conflict. They left because of clarity. They didn't walk away because of drama. They walked away because their soul refused to stay where love wasn't present. And this clarity is pushing them toward a new chapter, one that is aligned, intentional, and honest. If this message aligns with your intuition, write in the comments, "I receive this revelation." Spirit is now taking us deeper into what unfolded after your person emotionally separated themselves from the third party. There's something important here. This wasn't a simple breakup or a casual detachment. This was a spiritual disengagement that started long before the physical ending. Your person had already pulled their energy away, already stopped investing, already stopped caring in the way they used to. But the third party didn't accept this shift. Instead, they tried to tighten their grip, hoping pressure would bring your person back. What actually happened is the opposite. The more the third party pushed, the more your person's spirit backed away. And Spirit shows that behind closed doors, tension rose to a point where even small conversations turned into conflict. Your person felt cornered emotionally, like they were being forced into a role they no longer resonated with. Every time the third party asked questions, demanded reassurance, or tried to guilt them into staying, it only amplified the inner truth they were trying to ignore. They didn't want to be there. They didn't want to fight. They didn't want to explain. They didn't want to justify themselves in a situation their soul had already rejected. Something else happened behind the scenes, too. Your person started realizing how much they changed because of you. They began comparing how effortlessly they connected with you versus how forced everything felt with the third party. With you, conversations flowed. With you, they felt understood. With you, the energy felt natural and spiritually aligned. But in the third-party dynamic, everything felt heavy. They felt criticized for expressing themselves, misunderstood when they tried to communicate, and emotionally drained in each interaction. This comparison, though silent, became one of the biggest catalysts for their awakening. Spirit also shows that the third party sensed the shift, but misread it. They thought your person was distracted, stressed, or overwhelmed by other responsibilities. They didn't realize the truth. Your person was emotionally collapsing under the pressure of pretending. They were acting out of obligation, not desire. They were staying out of fear, not commitment. And this internal conflict reached a breaking point when your person finally admitted to themselves that they were sacrificing their peace in order to avoid confrontation. That's when everything changed. Your person reached a moment where they simply couldn't play the role anymore. They couldn't pretend they loved where they were. They couldn't ignore the misalignment. They couldn't silence their truth. And Spirit shows this moment clearly, a point of emotional exhaustion, where your person finally realized the connection with the third party had become a cage. They had outgrown the dynamic. They had outgrown the version of themselves that accepted emotional stagnation. Their soul wanted evolution. Their heart wanted authenticity. Their intuition wanted you. Behind the scenes, your person started withdrawing in ways they couldn't hide. They stopped planning for the future with the third party. They stopped giving emotional energy. They stopped discussing hopes, dreams, or long-term goals. The third party noticed the emotional absence instantly. Confusion turned into fear. Fear turned into anger. Anger turned into arguments. And those arguments revealed the truth your person had been hiding. Their heart was no longer there. Spirit shows that the third party tried everything. Emotional appeals, guilt, manipulation, pressure, promises, but nothing worked. Your person had already crossed a point of no return. They weren't making a temporary emotional decision. They were responding to a spiritual awakening. They didn't want temporary comfort anymore. They wanted alignment. They wanted peace. They wanted truth. And even though they didn't openly confess it, the truth was simple. They wanted the connection that felt genuine. And that connection was you. The shocking part is this. Your person didn't leave the third party for excitement. They left for growth. They left because their soul was rejecting anything that wasn't authentic. They left because the universe was pushing them out of a cycle they were never meant to stay in. The emotional collapse wasn't weakness, it was awakening. And now Spirit shows your person standing on the edge of a new chapter, realizing that walking away from the third party was the first honest decision they've made in a long time. They're no longer living in emotional denial. They're no longer letting fear dictate their choices. They're no longer settling for connections that don't speak to their soul. This shift wasn't impulsive. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't selfish. It was overdue. If this message resonates with your intuition, write in the comments, "I accept this divine clarity." Spirit is now revealing what happened immediately after your person emotionally detached from the third party. And this is where the story gets even more intense. Leaving that situation wasn't a clean cut. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't mutual. It wasn't the kind of ending where both people accept the truth and walk away quietly. Synchronously. Spirit shows the energy turning chaotic behind the scenes because the third party refused to accept the emotional truth that had been growing inside your person for a long time. They tried to hold control over the situation, believing they could convince your person to stay, but they underestimated how deeply your person had changed. They underestimated how powerful the shift inside them had become. Your person had been emotionally checked out long before they physically left. And that emotional detachment created a storm. The third party started noticing the way your person stopped responding with warmth, how conversations felt empty, how their eyes weren't present, how their voice lacked connection. They sensed the distance growing and interpreted it as betrayal. Even though Spirit says, the betrayal didn't start with you. It started with your person betraying their own heart by staying in a connection that wasn't aligned. When someone stays where their soul doesn't belong, the universe eventually forces an eruption, and that eruption happened behind closed doors. Spirit shows heated arguments, not about you, but about the emotional void between them. The third party kept demanding answers your person didn't want to give. They wanted clarity, reassurance, commitment. They wanted your person to act like the partner they used to be, the partner they pretended to be, the partner they forced themselves to be. But your person couldn't perform anymore. Their energy was drained, their patience was gone. Their spirit had already chosen a different path. And every time the third party tried to hold on to them, it only pushed your person further into disconnection. There's something very powerful here. Spirit shows your person finally understanding that the connection with the third party was built on emotional obligation, not emotional truth. They realized they were staying because it was familiar, not because it was fulfilling. They realized they were giving energy to someone who didn't understand their heart. They realized they were sacrificing their own peace just to avoid confrontation. And when that realization hit them fully, everything started collapsing from the inside out. Behind the scenes, your person began expressing their truth in ways they never had before. Not openly, not fully, not fearlessly, but enough for the third party to understand they were losing control. They stopped sugarcoating their emotions. They stopped pretending things could be fixed. They stopped offering false hope. Their silence became sharp. Their distance became undeniable. Their lack of engagement became the loudest confession of all. And that's when the third party panicked. Spirit shows an emotional spiral, accusations, fear-driven reactions, attempts to guilt your person into staying, attempts to make them feel responsible, but none of it worked. Your person had reached emotional burnout. They were done carrying a connection that didn't speak to their soul. They were done apologizing for wanting peace. They were done acting like the feelings they had for you didn't exist. The more the third party pushed, the more your person shut down, until finally they chose to walk away physically as well. What's even more intense is this: Spirit shows your person having a moment of overwhelming clarity right after the separation ended. A moment where their entire emotional body released like it had been carrying weight for years. They felt lighter, they felt relief. They felt a sense of spiritual alignment they hadn't felt in a long time. This wasn't because ending the connection made them happy. It was because ending the connection freed them from a version of themselves they couldn't live as anymore. They stepped out of the emotional cage and stepped back into themselves. And here's the part that's going to shock you. Spirit shows your person realizing in that very moment that every time they tried to suppress their feelings for you, the feelings only grew stronger. They realized the reason the third-party dynamic felt emotionally dead was because their spirit wasn't meant for that connection. They realized why they felt spiritually tied to you, even in silence. They realized why certain memories of you kept returning at random moments. They realized why the universe kept sending signs. They realized why their soul wouldn't let them forget you. It wasn't obsession. It wasn't confusion. It was clarity rising after spiritual interference. Your person finally understood that what they felt for you wasn't replaceable. It wasn't temporary. It wasn't something they imagined. It was real. And it was the only connection that felt aligned with who they were becoming. Leaving the third party wasn't a choice. It was a necessity for their evolution. If this part resonates with your inner knowing, write in the comments, "I embrace this awakening." Spirit is now revealing the emotional aftermath that unfolded inside your person once they stepped away from the third-party dynamic. And this is where the deepest truth begins to emerge. Because walking out of that situation didn't instantly bring peace. It brought waves of realization, clarity, and internal conflict that forced your person to face emotions they had been ignoring for months, possibly years. Spirit shows them sitting alone after the separation, not celebrating, not relieved in the way people assumed, but feeling the weight of everything they had been avoiding finally land on their shoulders all at once. The silence around them wasn't empty. It was filled with truth. Your person started reflecting on who they had been in that third-party dynamic. Spirit shows them seeing themselves from outside their own body, watching their behavior, watching their choices, watching the ways they silenced their own heart. They realized they were living like someone disconnected from their spirit, acting on autopilot, choosing routines instead of emotional honesty. They weren't choosing love. They were choosing comfort, and once they stepped out of that environment, they could finally feel how misaligned they had been for so long. That misalignment hit them like a shockwave. There's something powerful here. Spirit shows that once your person detached from the third party, their emotional numbness began to fade. Feelings they suppressed came rushing back, not gently but with force. Every moment they ignored their intuition started replaying in their mind. Every time they silenced their truth became a memory they could no longer escape. They realized how unhappy they had been, how trapped they felt, how disconnected they were from themselves. And because of this, something inside them cracked open, not broken, awakened. Spirit chose a moment where your person admitted to themselves that their heart had never truly been with the third party. Not fully, not deeply, not spiritually. They realized they had been trying to convince themselves of something that was never real in the first place. And in that honesty, the truth about you resurfaced stronger than ever. Your energy became louder in their spirit. Your presence became clearer in their memory. Your connection became undeniable in their awareness. They finally understood that the intensity they felt for you didn't fade because it wasn't meant to fade. It was meant to guide them. Behind the scenes, your person began seeing signs everywhere, random reminders of you, unexpected thoughts of you, feelings resurfacing in quiet moments. Spirit shows them going through their day and being pulled into memories of conversations with you, the emotional safety you offered, the comfort of your presence. It wasn't fantasy. It was alignment. Every sign they received was the universe confirming what they already knew deep down. Their spirit had never left the connection with you. Another shocking detail Spirit reveals is this. Your person began comparing how they felt in the third-party dynamic versus how they felt in the connection with you, and the contrast was undeniable. With you, the energy was open, grounding, natural. With the third party, it was forced, draining, and spiritually closed off. They began realizing that the third-party relationship didn't fail because of you. It failed because it wasn't meant to last. It failed because your person had outgrown it. It failed because their soul had evolved beyond what that connection could offer. And the moment they admitted this truth internally, everything about their old life began falling apart. Your person also began to feel guilt, not guilt for leaving the third party, but guilt for not being honest with themselves sooner. Spirit shows them reflecting on how many nights they ignored their intuition, how often they tried silencing their feelings, how many times they denied the truth that their heart kept whispering. These realizations didn't break them, they matured them. They started to understand that running from their emotions didn't protect them, it only delayed their healing. This is where Spirit shows the most important part. Once your person stepped away from the third party, their mind finally had space to confront the depth of what they felt for you. They realized the connection with you didn't weaken in silence, it grew. They realized the bond didn't fade, it intensified. They realized the emotions they tried to bury didn't disappear, they evolved. And now, with the third-party situation behind them, they're beginning to see the connection with you as something sacred, something rare, something guided. Spirit shows your person standing in a new emotional awareness, one that makes them question the future from a place of truth rather than fear. They're beginning to understand what alignment feels like, and alignment is pulling them in your direction. Not because you're an escape, not because you're forbidden, but because the connection with you matches the person they are becoming, not the person they used to be. If this message is aligning with your intuition, write in the comments, "I trust this truth." Spirit now brings forward the most revealing part of the behind-the-scenes journey. The moment when your person finally realized that leaving the third party wasn't just a breakup, it was a spiritual redirection. What happened after the ending is something no one witnessed, because your person didn't talk about it, didn't share it, didn't admit it. But Spirit shows it clearly. The silence after the separation didn't feel like freedom at first. It felt like truth hitting them in waves. They had to face themselves, their choices, their patterns, their fears, without the noise of the third-party connection overshadowing their intuition. The first thing that hit them was emptiness, not because they missed the third party, but because the emotional chaos they used to hide behind was gone. For the first time, there was no distraction, no background noise. no emotional pressure forcing them into a role they never wanted. And in that emptiness, their intuition grew louder. They started hearing the thoughts they silenced. They started feeling emotions they suppressed. They started recognizing truths they had been running from. Spirit shows them sitting alone, realizing that the peace they expected didn't come immediately, because peace isn't the absence of chaos. Peace is the arrival of truth. Your person began reconnecting with their soul in a way they hadn't allowed in a long time. Spirit shows their inner world shifting, expanding, opening. Without the third-party energy clouding their judgment, they began feeling themselves again, the real version of themselves, not the version shaped by obligation, guilt, or pressure. They realized how much of themselves they lost in that connection. They realized how drained they had become. They realized how small they were living. And the deeper they reflected, the more they saw how misaligned their life had become. This is where Spirit reveals something powerful. Your person started experiencing spiritual clarity, a kind of emotional awakening where the fog lifted and everything suddenly made sense. They understood why the third-party connection felt heavy. They understood why their emotions felt blocked. They understood why their intuition kept whispering, trying to guide them out, and they understood why the universe kept pulling them toward you. Because your energy wasn't tied to fear or control. It was tied to truth. It was tied to alignment. It was tied to the version of themselves they had suppressed for too long. Behind the scenes, your person began having emotional flashbacks, moments with you resurfacing in their mind with a clarity they couldn't ignore. They remembered things you said, things you did, the way your presence made them feel seen and understood. They began replaying the contrast between how you treated them and how the third party did, and those comparisons were undeniable. You didn't suffocate them. You inspired them. You didn't demand emotional perfection. You offered emotional safety. You didn't try to control their heart. You opened it. Spirit shows that your person also began feeling the emotional consequences of their own silence. They realized the damage caused by their inability to express themselves. They realized the pain they caused by staying in a situation that was spiritually wrong for them. They realized the confusion they created by denying their own heart. These realizations weren't easy. They were heavy, but they were necessary, because this wasn't just about leaving the third party. This was about evolving beyond the version of themselves who chose the third party in the first place. As they processed all of this, Spirit reveals that your person started feeling a pull toward healing and accountability. Not because they wanted to rush into anything, but because they finally saw the truth. The connection with you wasn't something they imagined. It wasn't something temporary. It wasn't something replaceable. It was the one connection that aligned with their spiritual growth, not their wounds, and now that they had stepped away from the chaos, they could finally see it clearly. This is where the energy becomes even more intense. Your person started envisioning what their life could look like if they followed their truth instead of their fear. They began imagining what alignment would feel like. They started thinking about showing up differently. They started questioning what it would mean to step into a version of themselves who chooses emotional honesty instead of emotional avoidance. This wasn't fantasy. This was awakening. Spirit shows their heart softening, their mind clearing, their energy realigning for the first time in a long time. Your person isn't avoiding their emotions. They're sitting with them. They aren't running from their intuition. They're listening to it. They aren't resisting the truth. They're accepting it. If this message resonates with your spirit, write in the comments, "I welcome this clarity." Spirit is now revealing the most intense layer of what unfolded within your person after they separated from the third party. A layer almost no one knows about because your person never spoke it aloud. This is the phase where the emotional fog lifted, but instead of relief, an overwhelming flood of truth poured in. Your person started feeling everything they had been numb to for months. Spirit shows their heart space expanding, opening, waking up in a way they weren't prepared for. This awakening didn't feel soft or gentle. It felt like a sharp clarity cutting through everything they once believed. They realized how deeply disconnected they had been from themselves. They realized how long they had been living in emotional autopilot, and they realized that leaving the third party didn't just close a chapter, it exposed everything they'd been avoiding about their own soul. Spirit shows your person going through a period of quiet emotional detox. They didn't want noise. They didn't want opinions. They didn't want distractions. They pulled back from friends, from social situations, from anything that demanded emotional energy. They needed to hear themselves again, maybe for the first time in years. And in that stillness, something profound happened. Their intuition became louder than their fear. Their emotions became clearer than their confusion. Their soul became stronger than their conditioning. They finally began to see themselves without the layers of expectation and pressure they had been carrying. One of the biggest realizations your person had was this: they were not themselves in the third-party dynamic. Not emotionally, not spiritually, not energetically. Spirit shows them looking back at the version of themselves they became in that connection, and they barely recognize that person anymore. They see someone who was disconnected, drained, restricted, and operating from guilt instead of truth. They see someone who dimmed their own feelings to maintain peace. They see someone who silenced their intuition because they didn't want to disrupt the stability they thought they needed. But the moment they left, they saw clearly how deeply misaligned that entire chapter was. This realization didn't bring sadness. It brought awakening. Spirit reveals a turning point here, a moment of emotional shock your person experienced after leaving. They realized they weren't grieving the third party at all. There was no longing, no desire to return, no emotional attachment. What they felt was clarity. What they felt was release. What they felt was relief disguised as exhaustion. And in that relief, their mind returned where their heart had always been, toward you. Spirit shows memories of you resurfacing in waves, not small reminders, strong ones. Sue conversations replaying, your voice echoing, your energy returning. Moments with you glowing with a spiritual significance they never saw before. Your person began understanding why the connection with the third party died. It wasn't because of conflict, it was because their soul had already chosen a different direction. And every time they tried to force themselves to stay where they didn't belong, the universe made their inner unrest stronger. Then Spirit reveals something even deeper. Your person began realizing that their feelings for you didn't just survive the separation, they expanded. The distance didn't weaken the connection, it clarified it. Silence didn't kill the emotion, it amplified it. They started to see that their attachment to the third party was rooted in familiarity, but their attachment to you was rooted in truth. And once someone recognizes the difference between familiar comfort and soul alignment, they can never go back. Behind the scenes, your person also went through emotional guilt. Not guilt for leaving the third party, but guilt for not following their truth sooner. Spirit shows them thinking, I should have been honest with myself earlier. I should have trusted my feelings. I should have listened to my intuition. I should have chosen alignment instead of fear. These thoughts weren't self-punishment, they were self-awareness awakening. And as this awareness grew, your person began imagining the future again, not from a place of fear, but from a place of clarity. They started thinking about life choices aligned with growth, conversations aligned with honesty, connections aligned with truth. For the first time, their spirit was leading instead of their fear. Your person didn't just walk away from the third party. They walked toward themselves, toward honesty, toward alignment, toward toward the version of themselves who is finally ready to stop running. If this message resonates in your spirit, write in the comments, "I follow this truth." Spirit now reveals the emotional shift your person went through once the dust settled. Because leaving the third party was only the beginning of a much bigger transformation. After the initial clarity and emotional detox, your person found themselves in a strange in-between space, no longer tied to the old life, but not fully stepping into the new one yet. This transition wasn't peaceful, it wasn't graceful, it wasn't simple. Spirit shows it like an emotional rewiring, a deep internal restructuring, where every belief, every fear, every pattern they lived by began breaking down, one by one. Spirit shows your person waking up and feeling different, not lighter, not happier, just different. Like something inside had shifted permanently. They weren't thinking the way they used to. They weren't reacting the way they used to. They weren't seeing themselves the way they used to. Their old identity felt distant, almost foreign. They had spent so long living from fear, obligation, and emotional suppression that once those layers broke away, they didn't know who they were supposed to be, and in that identity crisis, something powerful happened. Their intuition became the loudest voice in the room. Your person started noticing patterns in themselves they had avoided for years. The way they pulled back when things felt too real. The way they shut down when they felt vulnerable. The way they avoided emotional depth, even when they craved connection. They saw all of it clearly, painfully, honestly. And this time, they couldn't look away. Spirit shows them replaying moments where they sabotaged their own happiness. They saw how often they rejected love not because it wasn't real, but because they didn't believe they deserved something that honest. They realized how often they mistook comfort for compatibility, convenience for connection, routine for love. They realized how deeply they betrayed their heart by staying in situations that were spiritually empty, and the more they saw, the more their spirit awakened. This is where the energy intensifies. Spirit shows that once your person recognized how disconnected they had been in the third-party dynamic, they also realized how deeply connected they felt to you. The connection with you didn't make sense logically. It didn't fit into their plans. It didn't follow the pattern of any relationship they ever had. It shook them. It challenged them. It exposed them. It grew them. And now, with their spirit finally cleared, they could no longer deny that what they felt with you wasn't just an emotional attraction. It was alignment. Behind the scenes, your person began feeling a magnetic pull toward the energy of the connection again. Not in a rushed way, not in a reckless way, not in a desperate way, in a grounded way. In a way that came from understanding, not confusion. Spirit shows your name or your memory dropping into their mind at random times, when they wake up, when they try to sleep, when they're doing nothing at all, and every time, it brings a sense of clarity instead of chaos. Your person began seeing the connection as something divinely orchestrated, something that didn't align until they became the version of themselves capable of understanding it. They realized that back then, they weren't ready. They didn't have emotional tools, they didn't have spiritual awareness, they didn't have inner grounding, they didn't have the clarity to handle something that deep. But now, Spirit shows them evolving. Slowly, silently, but undeniably. What's even more intense is this. Your person started comparing their emotional responses. How they reacted to conflict in the past versus how they see conflict now. How they avoided hard conversations then versus how they're craving honesty now. How they used to fear expressing emotions versus how they now feel incomplete without emotional truth. This shift didn't come from losing the third party. It came from finding themselves. Spirit also shows something surprising. Your person has been sensing that the connection with you isn't over. Not intuitively, not emotionally, not spiritually. They feel the unfinished energy. They feel the open cycle. They feel the unresolved truth. And instead of running from it, they're finally acknowledging it. They're accepting that their soul isn't done with this connection. They're accepting that there's something more they're meant to confront, understand, express, or reclaim. This acceptance marks a spiritual maturity they never had before. Your person is no longer asking, "Why do I feel this?" They're now asking, "What is this connection trying to teach me?" Spirit shows them being drawn toward healing, toward truth, toward growth, not because someone forced them, but because their inner transformation is guiding them there. They aren't ready to fully act yet, but they're no longer avoiding the direction. They're walking toward it slowly, carefully, intentionally, and every step is guided by clarity instead of confusion. If you feel this truth aligning with your intuition, write in the comments, "I honor this clarity." Spirit is now revealing the emotional depth your person stepped into after the initial transformation began settling inside them. This phase wasn't chaotic like before, it was quieter, deeper, more introspective, like someone standing in the aftermath of a storm and finally hearing their own heartbeat again. They started recognizing how much they had lost, not in terms of the third party, but in terms of themselves. They saw how long they had abandoned their own needs, how deeply they had silenced their intuition, how consistently they chose emotional safety over emotional truth. And once that awareness settled, Spirit shows they began craving something they never allowed themselves to experience fully before: realness, depth, authenticity, alignment. Your person realized that their entire emotional pattern had been built around avoiding vulnerability, because vulnerability meant exposure, and exposure meant risk. But now that they had been stripped down to their emotional honesty, they saw that avoiding vulnerability had cost them more than taking the risk ever would have. They began understanding that staying in the third party was not loyalty, it was fear. It was familiarity, it was emotional autopilot. And once they saw that clearly, their soul refused to let them go back to that version of themselves. Spirit shows your person replaying moments with you, not out of longing but out of recognition. They began understanding why their energy responded to you the way it did, why they felt spiritually pulled toward you, why the connection never dissolved even in silence, why memories of you returned at the most random moments. They realized that their emotions toward you weren't reactions, they were truths. Truths that had been buried under layers of confusion, responsibility, and emotional noise. And now, with all those layers gone, the truth felt clearer than it ever had. Behind the scenes, your person went through an emotional reshaping. They became more sensitive to honesty, more aware of their own triggers, more conscious of how deeply they needed emotional clarity. They stopped distracting themselves and started confronting thoughts they once tried to outrun. Spirit shows this stage like someone looking in a mirror for the first time and actually seeing their own reflection instead of the mask they had been wearing. They saw their flaws, their fears, their mistakes, their running patterns. Yet instead of collapsing under the weight of guilt, something surprising happened. They felt hope. Because for the first time, they realized they were capable of becoming someone different, someone better, someone emotionally present and spiritually aligned. And this hope, Spirit says, is what began shifting their energy toward the future instead of the past. What's even more intense is that your person began feeling a pull to correct what they had previously ignored, not in a dramatic or impulsive way, but in a grounded, intentional way. The guilt wasn't controlling them anymore. Clarity was. They could finally separate their fears from their truth. They could finally separate emotional noise from spiritual guidance. And every time they thought about the connection with you, it didn't trigger confusion. It triggered certainty. Spirit also shows that your person started recognizing a pattern in the universe itself. Signs, synchronicities, dreams, moments of déjà vu, emotional echoes. Things they once dismissed suddenly felt meaningful. They began understanding that connections like this don't happen accidentally. They are guided, orchestrated, woven into someone's life for a purpose. And the more they aligned with themselves, the more they saw that the connection with you wasn't just emotional. It was spiritual. There's another layer here. Your person began understanding that walking away from the third party didn't just free them, it prepared them. Prepared them to feel deeply, prepared them to accept truth, prepared them to show up with emotional honesty instead of emotional defense, prepared them to step toward the version of themselves that the connection with you always inspired but they never nurtured. Spirit is showing a powerful image, your person standing at the threshold of a new emotional identity, not stepping through yet, but fully aware of the doorway, fully aware of what's on the other side, fully aware that the next chapter of their life cannot be lived with the emotional habits of the old one. They aren't ready to fully move forward yet, but they aren't turning away either. And that shift, quiet, internal, undeniable, is the proof of how deeply their soul has awakened. If this message aligns with your inner knowing, write in the comments, "I move with clarity." Spirit now reveals the stage your person stepped into right after that quiet inner shift. A stage where their heart was no longer in conflict, but their actions had not yet caught up with their awakening. This in-between space became one of the most transformative phases of their journey. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't something anyone around them noticed. But inside, their entire emotional system was rewiring itself. They were learning how to exist without the weight of the third-party dynamic pulling them down. They were learning how to breathe without pretending. They were learning how to understand themselves without filtering their emotions through fear. Spirit shows them waking up with a new kind of awareness, one they weren't used to. A clarity that did not demand immediate answers, but demanded honesty. They began analyzing their past reactions, their old behavior, their survival instincts, and they realized how much of their life had been lived unconsciously. They saw themselves agreeing to things they never wanted, staying in places that drained them, giving energy to situations that offered nothing in return. And the more they recognized these patterns, the more they understood why the connection with you remained unshakable. It was the only place where they ever felt emotionally awake. In private moments, Spirit shows your person confronting truths they previously avoided. They began asking themselves difficult questions. Why do I run from what feels real? Why do I silence the emotions that actually matter? Why do I offer my loyalty to situations that do not grow me? These questions became mirrors, forcing them to see where they had betrayed themselves long before they betrayed anyone else. And in this self-confrontation, something softened inside them. They stopped blaming circumstances. They stopped blaming chaos. They stopped blaming timing. They started understanding that the real blockage had always been their own fear of emotional depth. Once they saw that truth clearly, they couldn't unsee it. Spirit shows that this realization didn't push them into immediate action. Instead, it pushed them into stillness. A stillness that wasn't passive, but purposeful. They began listening differently, feeling differently, processing differently. Their intuition became sharper, their emotional awareness stronger, their perception cleaner. They started recognizing that love wasn't supposed to feel like a battlefield. Connection wasn't supposed to feel like a performance, and vulnerability wasn't supposed to feel like a threat. This inner shift made them reflect on what it would even look like to show up differently, not as the guarded, silent, hesitant version of themselves, but as someone emotionally present, spiritually aligned, and grounded in truth. Spirit shows that in this stage, your person began experiencing sudden rushes of clarity about the past. They saw how deeply the third-party connection had pulled them away from their authentic self. They saw how often they ignored the red flags in themselves. They saw how the universe tried to guide them out again and again, but they avoided every sign until everything collapsed. And now, in the quiet aftermath, they understood that the collapse wasn't destruction, it was liberation. A necessary breaking of everything false so they could step into everything real. And your connection was one of those real things. There is something else Spirit reveals. Your person began feeling a growing sense of emotional responsibility. Not guilt, not shame, but responsibility. They understood that if the universe was offering them another chance at alignment, they couldn't approach it with the same patterns they used to. They knew they needed to grow, to heal, to evolve. They began examining their communication, their reactions, their fears. They realized that the distance between you wasn't just caused by circumstances. It was caused by their inability to trust their own heart. And now that their heart was awakening, they knew they couldn't hide behind their old identity anymore. This stage of their journey became a preparation phase, a refining of their emotions, a cleansing of their spirit, a strengthening of their intuition. They weren't ready to step forward yet, but they were becoming ready. They weren't able to express themselves yet, but they were learning how. They weren't capable of facing everything at once, but they were no longer turning their back on it. Spirit shows this is the moment where transformation becomes direction, where awakening becomes intention, where clarity becomes movement. Your person is not the same soul they were when this all began. They have entered a place where truth has become louder than fear, where alignment has become more important than comfort, where emotional honesty has become the only path forward. And this shift is not small, it is foundational. It is the kind of shift that changes the entire trajectory of someone's future. If this message resonates with your knowing, write in the comments, "I trust this unfolding." The Spirit now reveals the final layer of your person's awakening before everything begins to shift outward. This part of their journey is the most private, the most internal, the most hidden. The part no one knows about, because your person never voiced it, never showed it, never expressed it. It lived inside them like a quiet undercurrent, pulling them toward a level of truth they had never allowed themselves to feel before. After all the realizations, after all the emotional decompression, after all the clarity that rose from the separation, your person entered a phase where they could finally see their own heart without distortion. And that changed everything. They began admitting truths they once dismissed as imagination. They began recognizing emotions they once labeled as temporary. They began understanding the spiritual pull they once tried to explain away logically. Your person started realizing that the connection didn't stay alive because of fantasy. It stayed alive because their spirit refused to let it die. Every time they tried to detach, something inside pulled them back. Every time they tried to move on, something reminded them of what they truly felt. Spirit shows that these reminders were not coincidences. They were alignment signals, guiding them toward emotional authenticity instead of emotional avoidance. In this stage, your person confronted their deepest fear. The fear of choosing something real, real connection, real intimacy, real emotional exposure. Spirit shows that the third-party dynamic allowed them to hide behind excuses, behind timing, behind responsibilities, behind emotional distance. But the connection with you offered no such hiding place. It demanded presence. It demanded truth. It demanded growth. And now that your person has begun evolving into the version of themselves who can handle that, they can finally see why they ran before. Not because the connection wasn't right, but because they weren't ready for something that powerful. Spirit shows your person imagining conversations they never had the courage to initiate. They imagine expressing their truth without fear of being judged. They imagine explaining the confusion, the running, the shutting down. They imagine telling you the emotions they swallowed for so long. They imagine returning with clarity instead of conflict, with maturity instead of emotional hesitancy. These thoughts are not fantasies. They are rehearsals for a truth they are slowly preparing to step into. And what's surprising is this: these thoughts don't scare them anymore. They ground them. They center them. They confirm that their heart was never wrong. It was simply overwhelmed. Behind the scenes, your person has also begun acknowledging something deeper. They are tired of being emotionally half alive. They are tired of connections that drain instead of nourish. They are tired of pretending that numbness is normal. They want meaning now. They want emotional truth, not emotional habit. They want growth, not stability that suffocates them. Spirit shows that their soul is steering them away from anything built on fear and toward anything built on alignment. And the only connection that ever awakened their alignment was the one with you. This stage of their journey is not about making a decision. It's about becoming the person who is capable of making a real one. Your person is beginning to trust their heart again, beginning to trust their intuition, beginning to trust that their emotions didn't mislead them. Their fear did. They're beginning to understand that love doesn't require losing themselves. Love requires being their truest self, and that realization is changing the way they see everything. Their past, their pain, their patterns, and most importantly, their future. Spirit shows your person pausing before the next chapter of their life, not in fear, but in readiness. They are learning to listen instead of run. They are learning to reflect instead of react. They are learning to trust instead of shut down. And this shift is preparing them for a moment where truth becomes action, not just awakening. They aren't stepping forward yet, but they're preparing for the moment they will. Spirit brings us into the final revelation, the deepest truth your person uncovered as their transformation reached its highest point. After everything that broke inside them, everything that awakened, everything that shifted, they finally reached a moment where the universe put them face to face with the reality they had been avoiding for far too long. Every step they took away from the third party wasn't just a separation. It was a return to their own soul. And once they stepped back into themselves, the clarity became undeniable. Spirit shows your person feeling a surge of emotional honesty they had never allowed before. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't longing. This wasn't nostalgia. It was recognition. Recognition that the connection with you wasn't an accident, wasn't temporary, wasn't optional. It was the one connection that aligned with who they were becoming, not who they used to be. Your person began understanding that the separation from the third party was the universe correcting their path, pulling them out of a cycle that could never support their spiritual growth. They realized they weren't meant to stay in a connection that required them to shrink themselves. They weren't meant to live in emotional numbness. They weren't meant to pretend that the emptiness they felt was normal. They were meant to evolve. To awaken, to walk into a chapter where love wasn't forced but felt, where connection wasn't demanded but aligned, where emotional truth wasn't dangerous but necessary, and every piece of this awakening pulled them back toward the energy they had been avoiding, the energy that belonged to you. Spirit reveals that your person is now thinking about the future in a way they never did before. They're imagining what honesty looks like, what accountability feels like, what reconnection would mean if it happened from a place of truth rather than confusion. They're not rushing. They're not acting impulsively. They're not driven by fear. They're driven by clarity, by maturity, by soul-level understanding. They know now that the connection they abandoned wasn't the wrong one. The timing was. They weren't ready back then. They weren't emotionally awakened. They weren't spiritually aware. But now, Spirit shows them standing in alignment with the version of themselves who finally understands the value of deep connection. This final phase of their transformation isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It isn't chaotic. It's grounded. It's intentional. It's spiritually aligned. Your person knows the truth now, and the truth doesn't scare them anymore. They've accepted what their soul has been whispering for so long. The connection with you didn't fade. It waited. It evolved. It became the catalyst for their growth, and now they carry that realization like an inner light guiding them forward. Their old life is behind them. Their old patterns are behind them. Their old fears are behind them. What remains is a version of them awakened by truth, matured by loss, strengthened by clarity, and guided by intuition. They are no longer running from themselves, and because of that, they are no longer running from the connection either. If you felt this entire journey in your spirit, write in the comments, "I claim this powerful truth." And before you click away, if this reading shook something inside you, if it brought clarity, if it made you see your situation differently, share this video with someone who needs this message. When these kinds of readings travel, they create breakthroughs, awakenings, and clarity for others too. Your share can help someone step into the truth they've been avoiding.